magazine dates back to 1713, and it was used basically as an arsenal off and on through the American Revolution. Keep in mind, when South Carolina first started as a colony, it basically was a private colony. They didn't have the luxury of a royal army or navy for protection, and they were relying on every able person to come inside this neighborhood and defend themselves from potential threats. Some of those threats they were concerned with are some of those that you see displayed in the museum. Issues with Spanish, pirates, slave insurrection, native tribes, and because, again, they don't have that king or queen's army, they decide that they better give themselves a bit of an advantage. This neighborhood that the powder magazine rests in was originally constructed as a fort. It actually had 100 cannons that went around this neighborhood. It had drawbridges, had moats, very much like a castle-like setup. And it becomes a little bit of a point of contention because people slowly but surely are very upset by how the management of the colony is being run by the 8 Lord Proprietors. So who are these guys? And the 1640s, the end of 1649, King Charles I is beheaded in England, and there's no longer a king in England. For 10 years, a man named Oliver Cromwell will be sort of a military dictator in England. There's a variety of names that he's given depending on your perspective of the Civil War that happened in the British Isles in those years. But that said, for 10 years, no monarch. And then these 8 supporters in England decided we're going to bring the slain king's son and restore him to the throne. And this will happen in 1660, and this is King Charles II, the namesake of the city of Charleston. So how does the king thank these supporters? He gives them a variety of things, status, but he gives them land. And the land that they're given is the land of Carolina. If you were to look at a map today, it would be basically the North Carolina border and South Carolina border, down to around Daytona Beach, Florida, from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It encompasses some 15 states today. So it's a bunch of land, but obviously they're going to settle this little bit that's right here. To begin with, starting Charlestown as the capital of the colony of Carolina. So people that come here looking for an opportunity, but mostly the idea is that they will find something that they can produce that will make money, and percentages then go back to the shareholders, the 8 proprietors as private landowners. And instead of a royal governor, they have a proprietary governor. They do have a local council that works, but again, it's all under the conditions that this is a proprietary colony of private enterprise, if you will. So there are a couple of issues. One of the major issues that happens in the year 1713, and that's the year this building was constructed to house gunpowder for this city again as a fortification. There are dealings with Native Americans that start to go basically kind of sour. One of those Native American tribes is the Yamasee. The Yamasee Nation, very upset over infringement upon lands, disagreements on trading, both sides, the British and the Yamasee, accused the other of cheating them on deer pelt trade. So a variety of little dynamics, but when it's all said and done, just 2 years after this building was constructed, we have a war called the Yamasee War. It's not just the Yamasee. The Yamasee create a confederation of tribes to try to push the English out of South Carolina. And it wasn't quite a kind of a black and white decision. What I mean by that is you would think, okay, all the natives, they're all against all of the Europeans. It's not quite that simple. There were allies involved. Because the Creeks, a very powerful nation, joined in with the Yamasee, with a few other native tribes. Immediately, their adversaries, the Cherokee, the Creeks Cherokee, their adversaries will fight and help out the English and fight against the Creeks. So the English and the Cherokee become basically allies from the very beginning of the colony's history, and they continue to trade over the years. Unfortunately for the Yamasee and their confederation, it doesn't work out in their favor, and after some 10 years or so of sporadic fighting, the Yamasee War is finally squelched. The threats do not end. In fact, in the year 1718, we have several pirates that blockade Charleston's harbor. So if the native wars were not enough, now we're dealing with pirates almost simultaneously. And these pirates, of course, are trying to steal from the Carolina coast. In the beginning of the colony's day, it wasn't much of a threat of pirates because the fact is if a pirate came, they probably came because you wanted them to. They had some illegal goods you could buy. Because a very early fledgling colony didn't really have anything of great wealth that they could steal, so they probably were just going to sell you some inexpensive items, as I mentioned. However, by 1718, all that had changed. The cash crop of rice had really begun to launch, and by that time, it's becoming a pretty wealthy colony, and there are some pirates that see an opportunity. We go from being a pirate customer to being a pirate victim. And to give you a case in point, in June of 1718, we have Steve Bonnet, the gentleman pirate, a pirate from Barbados. One time, a wealthy planter, a sugar plantation owner, decides to sell everything he owns to become a pirate. Kind of an odd situation, but he does. He buys a ship. He pays for a crew to go pirating, but he doesn't leave it at that. He decides to work with the best pirate of that era, the most infamous of all, Blackbeard. Blackbeard and Steve Bonnet will blockade Charleston's harbor together using a few ships, and as people try to come in and out and trade in the port, they'll stop them, hold people ransom, steal from the ships. We have a decision. Fight them off, or we can pay them off. They decide to ask Colonel William Rhett, who incidentally was one of the main contractors for helping construct the room that you're in. Colonel Rhett was head of the Committee of Defense, and he advised that you can commission me and a crew to go capture these pirates, but for the time being, pay them off, that we can open the gates of trade again, which was the whole point of the private colony. Okay, that made sense. Eventually, Colonel Rhett does capture Steve Bonnet, known now as the gentleman pirate, brings him back to Charleston after a trial. Bonnet will be retired here in December of 1718, as he will be hanged to his death on December 10th. As for Blackbeard, he's captured about a month later off the coast of North Carolina by Lieutenant Maynard of Virginia, but still the same. Some say with Blackbeard's death, so goes that golden age of piracy. For the people here in Charleston, the people that would have been coming in and out, getting gunpowder in this very room, concerned with these kinds of threats like the embassy attacks, pirates, they had enough. They petitioned to the King of England, King George I, and said, "We would like you to take this colony under your belt as a royal colony." And we receive benefits as official English citizens, but we also will receive the royal governor here, and of course the royal army. Does the king agree to this? Yes, because there's a lot of reasons, but one of the big ones that he sees the advantage of making money on the cash crops like rice, and indigo eventually comes into play. Deerskin is still a huge trade. And they also do little things like lumber and different naval stores and pitch and tar, things like that. So they're making a lot of money here at this port city of Charlestown. So this room is then handed over under the jurisdiction of the Redcoats, if you will, of the British Army. And they still have issues. They have a variety of things. One is that as the colony thrives, it becomes pretty obvious that the majority of people in South Carolina are enslaved. In fact, by 1740, it's 2 to 1. Folks that are enslaved, meaning that there's a huge majority of folks that are not free, held by a minority of people who are free. That's kind of a dangerous combination. In 1739, the largest slave insurrection in colonial America history breaks out. And again, another reason why they're going to continue to maintain this room for gunpowder, for muskets and cannons, a fear of slave insurrection. We call that insurrection the Stello Rebellion. You may have heard that before. But the whole objective, of course, if you're part of the Stello Rebellion, trying to get your freedom, which way are you trying to head? What do you think? North? North? South. Anybody know who's south of us at this time in 1739? Spanish, yes sir. The Spanish, they basically had a policy that said if any of those who were enslaved from the Carolinas made their way south, after doing a short stint of service at St. Augustine, a fort they called Fort Mosé, for defending the Spanish fort, they eventually could gain their freedom. There's some incentive there for the person who was enslaved. There's also, of course, some big motivation by the Spanish king to do this because it might cause upheaval in a place like South Carolina, and Spanish Florida and British South Carolina are often, big rivals on trade and territory and this sort of thing. So the Stello Rebellion certainly contributed to that upheaval at that time. Yes, sir.
The slaves that were headed south, they were black, basically?
Yes.
Well, the slave trade was already going from Africa to
here,
back and forth.
When we had the first English settlers here in 1670, there were folks that were slaves on the boats. Not as many, of course, but by around 1708, there's just as many that are enslaved as there are that are free, and by 1740, there's twice as many enslaved. So it gives you a pretty good idea of how the economy is rapidly taking off to produce rice and A little bit of cotton, but mostly rice, indigo, and that sort of thing. Good question. The French then become our next major concern. The British and the French are beginning to fight all over the world. The French and Indian Wars, we call it here in the Americas, is one of the first major wars, world wars in America, if you will, as part of what becomes America. As they're struggling for control of the American Empire, they begin to fight in all the colonies, and depending on where you're from in the United States, you might be familiar with what episodes and chapters took place in the French and Indian War. What's the scene look like here in South Carolina? Basically, we call it the Cherokee War. I point here because there's a portrait of one of the battles of the Cherokee War. We have the South Carolina Independent Company, the Army here, trying to basically rid a section of South Carolina of the Cherokee. So it's kind of intriguing. And this scene, it actually worked the other way around. The Cherokee had invited the British to come and have a fort in far, far western South Carolina. At that time, it was what we call Tennessee, but it was a far western fort called Fort Loudon. The Cherokee laid siege to the fort. The British had no choice but to exit the fort. The next day, after the British got out, they started to head back towards the coast. The Cherokee will attack the English, and it ends up being a large Cherokee victory. Unfortunately for the Cherokee, that's one of a few victories that they'll have. Largely, the British will prevail, and the Cherokee will lose much of their land because they chose to ally with the French and not the British during the Cherokee War. You might recall that during the Yamasee War, a generation before, the Cherokee allied with the British. So kind of a change of size. Yes, ma'am?
Where did the Trail of Tears come in?
That comes later. That's in the 19th century with President Jackson's policies in the 1820s. And basically, they're exiting members of the Cherokee Nation. It'll be their grandkids, if you will, exiting them from east North Carolina, east North Carolina, and out into the out west, Oklahoma. And that's why you'll see Cherokee factions and reservations out west now too. But there's still, as you probably are familiar, still a Cherokee reservation in North Carolina, still near Maggie Valley. Good question. And there is a connection between these folks, of course, with that, but just a different history. So the last time they're going to keep gunpowder in here will be our next major conflict. Does anybody know what that one is?
Civil War.
Back up earlier. Closer to the French and Indian War. American Revolution. American Revolution is the next one. Keep in mind, because of the Cherokee Wars and all those taxes they had to raise to pay for the debts of the Cherokee War, or the French and Indian War, they will eventually protest some of these taxes, as you're familiar with the Tea Act, the Stamp Act, and the Revolutionary War will break out. This building, once again, witnesses this. It's used by the Continental Army for a period of time during the American Revolution. A lot of folks ask us many times, was this building part of it? And again, yes, it was, but did Charleston have any real battles? We had the longest siege of the American Revolution, a 42-day siege. A cannonball evidently almost hit this building. They decided to move the gunpowder out of here and hide it a few blocks away beneath the Exchange Building. And there it sat for a couple of years, even during a time when the British occupied Charleston. Apparently the British never found the gunpowder moved from here to the Exchange. And when they left at the end of the war, that was in December of 1782 when they left Charleston's docks, the powder, apparently most of it was still good. Of the 14,000 pounds, only about 4,000 pounds were damp and bad. The rest of it was still good. So it's a good thing that the British didn't get that and use it against the Continental Army. That said, this room was basically decommissioned. We don't believe it was ever part of a formal military campaign at that point. From time to time, they'll put a little powder in it, but mostly they're using it for miscellaneous storage. You'll learn about a specific thing that they kept in here in the 19th century from Mr. Long in a moment, so I won't ruin that story for you. But that said, miscellaneous storage, a print shop, a blacksmith shop, a horse carriage house. They added that large door that's over there after the American Civil War to accommodate a horse carriage. So no real military use to really speak of during the American Civil War. It was in a pretty rough form by the late 19th century. There was talk of knocking it down, and that's when a group of ladies came together. They purchased the building, turned it into a museum in 1903. It's our first preservation project for a building of this kind in Charleston, so we're very lucky to still have it. It's been a museum again since 1903. So the exhibits rotate around. But overall, we pretty much interpret the colonial history as this is one of just a few structures that we have left from that early walled city history, the proprietary era, something also left over from the American Revolution, which is pretty unique too. Yes, sir.
Why would they move the gunpowder from here to the exchange building? Wouldn't this be a better secure building?
There's a couple of thoughts. One is that the British already knew that powder was kept here, and it was inevitable that they were going to be negotiating surrendering the city to the British, which did happen in May of 1780. And there's a thought that perhaps let's hide it from them, so when they get to the city, we can't get it out fast enough, and we can't get it through their lines because they're surrounding the city. So rather than find it, let's try to hide it somewhere. Maybe they won't find it. The other thing is that later on in General William Moultrie's memoirs, he mentions that a cannonball was struck 10 yards from this building, and perhaps during the siege, he suggests maybe they were deliberately targeting and trying to cause a catastrophe, certainly if a cannonball had struck.